So that's why you really need to understand how a calculate column will behave in a zero environment. Okay, in the zero environment, there's no row context anymore. So the calculate column may not behave as you thought. Okay, you need to think about what filters you have imposed here. Okay, in a zero, then think about how those filters is going to affect how this calculated column is going to be presented in this zero. Okay. To get a little bit deeper into this problem, let me again pull this data field assets end of year to be part of the value. Okay, and instead of using the sum, I'm going to use the count. Okay, so you see here under this for this row, year 2022 for Apple, we actually have 4 values of this data field assets end of year. Okay, that's why the summation is kind of summing across the 4 values. Okay, also for year 2023 we have 4 values of this asset. All right, and if we're looking at Apple in general, then we actually have 8 rows of this column assets EOY. Okay, we have 8 rows of this data field involved when we calculate this, when we try to find the value for this row in particular. Okay, so again here we're using the sum, so it's going to be the sum across the 8 rows. Okay, so in our particular situation, do we have a solution to show the right number in here? Okay, although I mean we learned that filter context is working very differently as a row context, and it's going to affect how the calculate column is going to be shown or presented in a zero. But in this case, do we have a solution to kind of accommodate this different setting and show the right number for example, Apple in year 2022 for the end of year asset? In fact, we have, because if you look at this number, all right, if we're looking at Apple in year 2022, all the 4 numbers, all the 4 rows regarding assets end of year is the same, 32. So we can just take one of them, say the minimum of it. Okay, the minimum across the 4 rows is going to be 3. I'm sorry, it's going to be the 32 as well. Okay, or the maximum of the 4 is still going to be 33, or the average. Okay, so because in this particular situation, the value across the 4 rows are the same, so we can just take the minimum or maximum or average out of the 4, and we're going to report the right number. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to still pull this data field here as the last here. Okay, there's another column shown here. Okay, and instead of summation, I'm going to use the minimum. So now I will have the right number here. Well, for year 2022 we have 33. For year 2023 we have 32. Okay. So what about the Apple in general? Okay, it's 32. Well, we don't specify which year we're talking about. We're just talking about Apple in general. So how can we figure out what's the asset end of year for Apple in general? Okay. Again, you cannot think in that way anymore, because here we're working on a filter context in a zero. So the filter context is working on Apple in general. Okay, so there's going to be 8 rows involved. And here you are basically telling Power BI to return the minimum regarding this data field across the 8 rows. So the minimum across this 8 rows is going to be 32. Okay? So that's why 32 is reported here. Okay, this 32 is not really a end of year number for a particular year anymore. We are not really calculating that here. Okay, here we're just calculating the minimum out of the 8 rows, and that number turns out to be 32, and that number turns out to be the assets at the end of year for year 2023. Okay, so that's how this calculate column behave in a zero environment. You can check, for example, Honda as well, and here Well, let's look at Ford actually. So in year 2024, for Ford, again, there's 4 values regarding assets end of year. Okay, so for Ford in year 2024, that's a 4 rows involved. Okay, once you look at this row, this row is gonna be a filter context imposed on the data set regarding Ford in year 2024. So we're basically looking at these 4 rows, and there's gonna be 4 values regarding assets end of year, right? So you see there's 4 values here regarding assets end of year, and the summation of these 4 values, okay, 425s. So that's gonna be a 100. Of course, that's not the value you want to report. Okay, so out of these 4 values, we can take the minimum of it. Okay, so that's why we use this minimum of assets end of year. So that's going to be a 25 for year 2024 for Ford. Okay, for year 2025, okay, we're looking at these 4 rows. Those are the rows being filtered out once we focus on this particular filter context. Okay, so these 4 rows, when we sum up those 4 numbers together, it's a 108. Okay, and here we know there's 4 rows involved. Okay, and again, we don't need the sum. We need actually the minimum or one of those 4 rows. Okay, so that's going to be the minimum out of these 4 rows, 27. So that's how it works. Okay, now if you look at the Ford, this row regarding Ford in general, okay, then we're looking at 8 rows altogether regarding Ford. Okay, and this 208 is basically summation across these 8 rows regarding assets end of year. All right, turns out to be 208. All right, again here in this cell it tells, well, there's 8 rows involved actually. All right, and because here this cell is calculating the minimum of this data field across 8 rows. All right, so the minimum out of this 8 rows is 25. Okay, that's why here you see a 25. Okay, again, be very careful when you put a calculate column in a zero, especially like something like a matrix here. Okay, really understand in a matrix zero, the filter context is working on this data table, and you no longer has a row context. So be careful with the number reported in this zero regarding a calculated column.